He tasted blood when he bit his tongue and still stood up, because if he waited another second his father would marry a woman who had been killed before. The church smelled of lilies and furniture polish. Sunlight slanted through stained glass in soft, holy colors, and 100 people leaned forward in blissful ignorance while Richard Collins, steady, gentle, late 50s with a tremor he hid when nervous, stood at the altar like a man about to step through a door he couldn't see. Ethan watched his father's shoulders square as the organ swelled, watched the bride glide down the aisle with the practiced grace of someone who studied faces for weaknesses, and felt a cold certainty that had lived in his chest for months bloom like a bruise. Vanessa's veil floated and her smile was the kind that made older aunties whisper blessings. But behind that lace and powdered calm, Ethan remembered a different picture, the one he had found at 2 a.m. on a site that no longer exists. A photo with a different name and the same eyes that never smiled even when the mouth did, and the terror in his belly tightened into resolve. He was 17, too young to carry the weight of proof and too old to pretend he didn't know what he knew. And as the priest lifted his hands and the congregation fell into a hush that felt like a held breath before a cliff, Ethan saw his father glance back, not toward Vanessa but toward the front pew, toward him, toward the last living witness of the life they had built after his mother's death. And that glance begged for reassurance he could not give. The music faded, the church settled. The priest's voice warmed the air with old, gentle words, and Ethan's heart hammered like a fist against a locked door. Because the sentence that always comes in ceremonies was coming for him now, the sentence that gives a last chance to truth, if anyone here knows of any reason. He had sworn to himself he would not be that reason. He had promised to respect his father's hope. But hope is a poor bodyguard when a predator smiles, and Ethan stood even before the priest reached the word reason, because his mouth was already moving and the panic was already a taste on his tongue, and the thought of his father, signing his life over to a woman whose past had been scrubbed like a crime scene, made his knees weak but his voice strong. Heads turned, whispers flitted like startled birds. Vanessa's steps halted with a tiny stumble she hid by lifting her chin a fraction higher, and Richard's eyes widened, not angry, not yet but wounded, like a man hit by a stray bullet meant for someone else. The church did what churches do when the script goes wrong. It rustled and breathed and tried to pretend it hadn't seen what it had just seen. But there is no pretending when a son interrupts a wedding with blood on his tongue and terror in his bones. Ethan said, "Dad, please," and felt how small that word sounded compared to the roaring in his ears. Then he looked straight at the bride, and the calm in her face told him he was not a boy to her at all. He was a problem, a variable to be solved, and in that cool appraisal he found confirmation of everything he had learned and everything he feared he had not learned yet. He did not shout that she was a liar or a thief or worse, not at first, because the room would close around name-calling like a fist around air. Instead, he told the truth in the only way people of a certain age will hear it, steady and plain with the weight of specifics. He said her name like a verdict, and it wasn't Vanessa, and a tiny quiver raced across the muscles of her jaw, here and gone, too fast for most, but not for him. A murmur moved across the pews like wind over grass, and the organist touched a nervous chord and pulled his hands back as if he had burned himself. The priest tried Rebecca, "We will continue in a moment," and caught himself, because he had said the wrong name, and even that slip shook Richard more than Ethan had expected, because a man who wants to believe still knows when a crack has appeared under his feet. Ethan reached into his jacket and felt the envelope press against his palm like a heartbeat, and with the other hand he gripped the pew to keep his courage from draining into the floorboards. Then he spoke not to the crowd but to one man, his father, reminding him quietly of the campsite that first summer after his mother died, when they had almost lost the trail and had survived because they trusted their map and each other. And Richard blinked as if someone had opened a window in a smoke-filled room. Vanessa's smile did not break, but it cooled, the way ice hardens when heat threatens it, and she turned her head slightly so the veil draped a little more over her cheek, hiding the eyes that had never learned to be human. Ethan said he would sit if his father asked him to. He said he would swallow every word if he could believe they were safe. But safety requires knowledge, and he had knowledge, and that knowledge would sit in his throat forever like a stone, if he did not place it on the altar of this morning. A cousin cleared his throat as if to scold the boy. A woman near the back dabbed her eyes because weddings always made her cry, and she was not sure why she was crying now. And Richard spoke Ethan's name in a voice that still had the old music in it, the one that used to soothe fevers and nightmares. And in that voice there was a question and a request and a plea. And Ethan answered all of them by stepping into the aisle and lifting the envelope into the light that filtered through saints and swords and doves. The seal had been broken hours ago, but he had closed it again with care, because he wanted his father to feel how final the truth could be. And as he held it out, he thought of all the nights he had sat in dark rooms with the screen washing his face, chasing shadows through trails of data, piecing together a name that kept slipping its skin like a snake, and the way each discovery had felt like pulling thread from a sweater, small and nothing until the whole thing unraveled. He did not say the word police, though it throbbed between his teeth. He did not accuse her of the thing he had seen suggested between lines in old articles and whispers on long-abandoned forums. He only said, "Dad, please look." And for a fragile moment, all that existed was a father's hand reaching toward an envelope, and a bride calculating angles that would keep that hand from touching paper. And the silence held its breath with everyone else as the priest lowered his eyes and the ushers pretended to be furniture, and the organist wished he had chosen a different profession. Then Vanessa moved. Not much. Only a half step and a turn that made the veil shimmer like mist and drew every gaze back to her smile. And in that graceful pivot, Ethan saw danger as clearly as if it had a color and a smell, because the step was toward the side door, and the side door led to the narrow corridor behind the sacristy, and the corridor led to the parking lot. And in the fraction of time it took the envelope to change hands, Ethan understood that this was not a woman about to answer questions, but a hunted thing about to run. And the certainty that she had done this before bolted through him so hard he had to steady himself on the pew. And he said, "Don't let her leave, Dad. Not until you see what's in your hands." And at last Richard looked down and began to read. 6 months earlier, the snow was still thick on the roofs and the Collins house smelled of reheated coffee and exhaustion. Richard had just turned 58 and was trying to believe that loneliness could be cured by routine. He worked, came home, watched the same news anchors who always seemed to talk too loudly about problems too far away. Then at a community fundraiser for the local hospital, he met Vanessa. She was wearing a simple gray coat and a red scarf that looked almost accidental, a flash of warmth against the sterile hall. She told him she volunteered in the hospice ward, that she'd lost her husband young, that she admired how people survived grief. Richard felt the ground shift under him, because she spoke in the exact soft tone his late wife used when talking about mercy. Ethan had come along that night only because his father insisted. He remembered watching Vanessa laugh with his father, the way she placed her hand on his arm as if she already knew where to fit herself in his life. She looked harmless, kind even, but something about her precision bothered him, the way she used stories like tools. She remembered details too perfectly, timed her smiles to silence, never overlapping anyone's words. It was charm by calculation, and Ethan felt it immediately, though he couldn't explain why. When they got home, his father was brighter than he'd been in years, humming while washing dishes, and Ethan couldn't bring himself to ruin that moment. The months that followed turned their quiet house into something new. Vanessa came often, bringing dinner, organizing closets, pretending not to notice how awkward Ethan became around her. She said she wanted to help him study for college applications, said she saw potential in him, and though her voice was smooth, Ethan felt the unspoken weight behind that word, control disguised as care. Richard, blind with gratitude, saw only kindness. For the first time since his wife died, he began planning trips again, smiling at breakfast, talking about starting fresh. Then small things started to vanish. Richard's checkbook, a watch his wife had given him, the spare keys from the hallway drawer. Each time he laughed it off, called himself forgetful, but Ethan noticed the pattern. He also noticed the new lockbox in Vanessa's car, the calls she took outside late at night when she thought no one could hear, the scent of expensive perfume that didn't fit the modest nurse she claimed to be. One evening, Ethan overheard part of a conversation, her voice low, urgent, saying, "He doesn't suspect anything." When she turned and saw him standing there, she smiled so calmly that he almost doubted what he'd heard. The first twist came one gray afternoon when Ethan's friend Tyler, who worked part-time at a local electronics store, mentioned seeing Vanessa buying a new phone paid in cash. That same night, Ethan checked his father's bank app while Richard napped on the couch. $2,000 had been transferred out, home repairs, the note said. Their house hadn't seen a hammer in years. When Ethan confronted his father, Richard frowned and said Vanessa was helping with bills until her inheritance cleared. That word, Inheritance lodged like glass in Ethan's chest. He started digging. He searched her name online, first casually, then obsessively. There were too many Vanessas, none matching the woman he knew. But an image search brought up something chilling. A wedding photo from another state, different last name, same face, same eyes. The article was short. Local businessman missing after honeymoon trip. The wife's name was Melissa Crane. No charges, just a note that she'd moved out of town. Ethan copied the picture to his laptop, but by morning the article link was dead. He went to the police once, nervous and half convinced he sounded crazy. The officer listened, nodded, said without evidence they couldn't investigate someone for being charming and mysterious. When Ethan told his father, Richard laughed, almost kindly. "You've been watching too many crime shows," he said. That laughter stung worse than anger. Days later, Ethan found Vanessa in the kitchen flipping through old photo albums. She had rearranged the pictures, placing one of herself between images of his mother and father. When he reached for it, she said softly, "You should be happy for him. Ethan, people deserve to move on." Her eyes held his for a fraction too long, a silent warning that she knew what he was doing. That night, Richard announced their engagement. He told Ethan he'd never been more certain about anything. Vanessa pressed her fingers to her heart as if overwhelmed by love. But Ethan saw her other hand resting lightly on Richard's wrist, as though claiming ownership. The second twist came the next morning. Ethan opened his laptop to show Tyler the photo he'd found, but the file was gone, the folder empty. His online accounts had been accessed from another device. He checked his drawers. Nothing missing but a small flash drive where he had stored everything he'd discovered. He felt panic rising, but when he looked out the window, he saw Vanessa in the driveway, looking straight up at him, smiling as if they shared a secret. For weeks, Ethan lived in that quiet terror, pretending everything was fine while feeling the walls close in. Richard grew distant, defensive, sometimes snapping when Ethan mentioned the past. Vanessa's presence was like perfume that lingered too long, sweet, heavy, suffocating. Ethan started to realize he wasn't just afraid of losing his father. He was afraid something worse was coming. He had glimpsed the shape of it, but not its depth. And then one evening, while clearing the kitchen table, he noticed a small cut on his father's wrist. When he asked about it, Richard said Vanessa had accidentally nicked him while cooking. But the wound was oddly shaped, thin, sharp-edged, like the slice from a razor blade. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the dark, staring at the engagement announcement Vanessa had drafted for the paper. The headline read, "Second chances find their way home." Ethan whispered into the silence, "Or find their graves." And the air in the room seemed to tighten around him, as though the house itself had started listening. The snow melted into spring, but for Ethan the thaw brought no warmth, only new shadows in familiar corners. Vanessa had practically moved in by then, her perfume hanging in the air like an invisible signature of ownership. Every drawer she opened, every curtain she changed, left a trace of her control in the house. She spoke sweetly to Richard, always gentle, always giving, but Ethan could see how each kindness came with an invisible thread attached, one that pulled his father a little further away each day. The woman moved like someone who had rehearsed life until she could perform it perfectly. She laughed at the right moments, comforted the right people, even volunteered at the church to polish her reputation. But beneath all that grace, Ethan sensed a cold, calculating stillness, the kind predators have before they strike. Richard's friends began to notice small differences. He withdrew from poker nights, stopped answering calls, claimed he was too busy planning the future. Vanessa encouraged that isolation with a soft touch on his arm, and a whispered reminder that love was supposed to be private, sacred, not shared with nosy outsiders. Ethan tried to speak with his father, to tell him that love shouldn't require distance from everyone else. But Richard only smiled tiredly and said, "You're young, Ethan. You'll understand when you've lost as much as I have." It was the kind of sentence that ended conversations. Ethan began watching her movements carefully, logging every inconsistency. One afternoon, he followed her when she claimed to be going to her hospital shift. Instead, she drove 2 towns over to a storage facility. She entered through the side door and didn't come out for 40 minutes. When she did, she was carrying a small locked case, the kind doctors use for medical equipment. Ethan snapped a photo from behind the bushes, heart pounding. Later that evening, he confronted her casually, asking how her shift went. She smiled, poured herself a glass of wine, and said, "Quiet, thankfully." The lie rolled off her tongue as smoothly as the liquid down the glass. That was when Ethan knew. She lied the way most people breathed. The next week brought the first real break in the mystery. Ethan received an anonymous email at midnight with the subject line, "You're not wrong." Inside was a single photo. Vanessa at a wedding altar, wearing a different hairstyle and a new name, Claire Holt. The man beside her looked vaguely familiar, someone Ethan thought he'd seen in one of the local obituaries from 2 years ago. He scrolled further and saw the name of the sender, unknown source. The email disappeared an hour later, self-deleting like it had never existed. Ethan barely slept that night. He took the information to the local library, printing out the obituary and piecing together the fragments. The deceased man's cause of death was listed as heart failure, but his age was only 45. A neighbor's quote in the old news clipping caught his eye. He was newly married. She left town the day after the funeral. Ethan's pulse spiked. Could Vanessa be that woman under another name? He printed everything and hid the papers in a biology textbook she'd never open. The following days stretched like wire. Vanessa grew more affectionate toward Richard, almost theatrical in her devotion. She cooked elaborate dinners, laughed too loudly, and made subtle jabs about Ethan's stress issues. One night, while she and Richard watched an old movie, Ethan overheard her say, "I think Ethan's still grieving in unhealthy ways. Maybe therapy would help." Her tone was calm, sweet, but the message was poison. She was setting the stage to make him look unstable, a dangerous, delusional teenager who might ruin their perfect life. Ethan's desperation grew. He decided to dig deeper into her so-called nursing background. Using a friend's help, he searched state medical registries for her license number. It didn't exist. The name Vanessa Crane was never registered anywhere. When he cross-checked Claire Holt and Melissa Crane, he found 3 suspended licenses in different states, all linked to women who had disappeared after investigations into medication theft and patient deaths. Each case ended the same way. The suspect vanished before trial. His stomach turned cold. He realized this wasn't just a woman with a shady past. She was someone who reinvented herself every time blood was spilled. He printed every piece of evidence he could find and hid it in a sealed envelope. But when he came home that night, his laptop screen was open, the power light blinking. A single note sat on the keyboard, written in her handwriting. "Curiosity can be dangerous, sweetheart." His breath hitched, she knew. Every nerve in his body screamed to run, but the thought of leaving his father alone with her was unthinkable. He shredded the note and flushed the pieces down the toilet, pretending nothing had happened. Then came the second twist, something even he hadn't imagined. One evening, Richard collapsed at the dinner table. His heart fluttered, his skin pale as ash. Vanessa screamed for Ethan to call 911, performing panic like a stage actress. The doctors later said it was a sudden arrhythmia, possibly stress-induced. Richard survived, but barely. While he was in the hospital, Vanessa stayed by his side like a devoted angel, gaining sympathy from every nurse in sight. Ethan, however, noticed the tremor in her hand when the police asked casual questions about the incident. He couldn't prove anything yet, but the way she tightened her grip on Richard's hand every time he tried to speak told him she was terrified of what he might remember. After Richard was discharged, he seemed even more attached to her. Trauma had softened his reason, and Vanessa took full advantage. She told him Ethan's constant suspicion was harming his recovery. The father and son barely spoke. Ethan felt trapped, like shouting through glass. He started recording her on his phone. Little things. A name she slipped, a story that contradicted her earlier ones. He gathered the fragments like evidence of a crime still unfolding. The breaking point came one evening when Ethan, scrolling through old local obituaries, found something that stopped his breath cold, a photo of a missing woman who looked exactly like Vanessa, except for one detail, the tattoo. A small blackbird on her collarbone. The woman in the picture had it. So did Vanessa. That was when Ethan knew without question. The person living in his house wasn't who she claimed to be. She was a ghost wearing another name, and his father was next on her list. The clock had started ticking, and Ethan knew that if he didn't act soon, The next obituary would have his father's name on it. The morning of the wedding broke too bright for what Ethan knew was coming. The world outside the Collins home looked peaceful, dew on the grass, birdsong tangled with distant church bells. But inside him, every breath felt like the second before impact. He had not slept. His hands trembled as he buttoned the black shirt he'd chosen not for ceremony but for war. The envelope inside his jacket pressed against his chest like a loaded weapon. Inside it were copies of documents, screenshots, and one photograph that could burn everything Vanessa had built. A police report stamped with the words "Person of Interest." Melissa Crane, alias Claire Holt, alias Vanessa Price. He didn't know who had sent the last file, the one that finally gave him proof, but he no longer cared. The truth was all that mattered. Downstairs, the scent of lilies filled the air, Vanessa's favorite flower. The irony was unbearable. She was radiant, floating from room to room, humming under her breath as if she had already won. Richard, pale but smiling, looked at her like she was light itself. Ethan's stomach churned at how fragile his father seemed. The faint shake in his hand, the weakness in his step that hadn't been there before the arrhythmia. Vanessa adjusted his tie, her eyes catching Ethan's reflection in the mirror for half a second. That look, cool, knowing, told him she was ready for anything he might try. The church stood like a waiting mouth. Guests filled the pews, their chatter innocent, oblivious. The organ began to play, and Ethan's pulse kept time with each note. He sat in the front row again, the same seat where months ago he had made himself a promise. If no one else would stop this, he would. The aisle seemed longer now, like a tunnel he might never emerge from. Vanessa entered, a vision in white, her veil softening the edges of her face, hiding the truth behind layers of silk. Every step she took tightened the knot in Ethan's chest. He saw the way she glanced at his father, then at him, a flicker of something triumphant, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. The ceremony began. The priest spoke, his words old and solemn, but they blurred into static in Ethan's ears. He was aware only of the envelope in his jacket, the sound of his own breathing and the rhythm of his father's smile as if nothing could go wrong. When the priest asked if anyone had reason to object, Ethan's heart kicked once hard. He looked at his father's fragile happiness and nearly stayed silent. Nearly. Until he saw Vanessa's hand slide behind her bouquet, her thumb brushing the side of a small silver vial attached to the stems. His breath stopped. The same kind of vial he had seen in her storage box. He stood up before he even knew he was standing. Gasps rippled through the pews. The organ stuttered to a halt. "Stop," Ethan said, his voice cracking through the stillness like a gunshot. Vanessa froze, her eyes narrowing a fraction before she forced a smile. "Ethan, please," Richard began softly. "Not here, son." But Ethan's voice had found its strength. "Dad, she's not who you think she is." He moved down the aisle, every step heavy with the weight of disbelief pressing from all sides. Vanessa tilted her head, still smiling. "This again?" she murmured, her tone patient and honeyed. "You're scaring people." He ignored her and held up the envelope. "Her name isn't Vanessa. It's Melissa Crane. Or Claire Holt. Or whatever she's calling herself this year." The whispering started then. Low, uncertain waves of sound filling the church. Vanessa's expression didn't falter. "He's been struggling," she said gently to the priest and the guests, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. "After his mother passed, he had episodes." Richard looked torn, eyes darting between them. "Ethan," he whispered, "please, not today." Ethan stepped closer. "She's lying, Dad. She's wanted in 3 states. Fraud, theft, maybe worse." He opened the envelope and threw the papers into the air. They fluttered like snow, settling on the marble floor, on the pews, on Vanessa's white dress. Gasps turned to murmurs as people leaned forward, squinting at the black and white photos and official stamps. That was when it happened. The side door creaked open and a man's voice broke through the chaos. "That's her." Everyone turned. An older man, limping heavily with a cane, stood in the doorway, his face pale with shock. "She stole my brother's money and he disappeared a week later." The silence that followed was razor sharp. Vanessa's mask cracked for the first time, her eyes flashing wide before she spun toward the nearest exit. "Stop her!" Ethan shouted, and his father stumbled forward in confusion as Vanessa bolted. The aisle exploded in motion. Chairs scraping, people shouting. Ethan chased her down the narrow corridor behind the altar, his heartbeat deafening. Vanessa's veil tore free, trailing behind her like a ghost. She reached for the back door, but Ethan grabbed her arm. "What did you do to him?" he yelled. She twisted, eyes cold as glass. "You should have stayed out of this," she hissed, pulling a small knife from the folds of her gown. The metal caught the light. He froze for half a second. Just enough time for her to shove him aside and run again. Richard's voice echoed from behind, raw and panicked. "Ethan!" He stumbled into view just as Vanessa slammed into a police officer entering through the side door. Someone the church staff had called when the shouting began. The impact sent the knife clattering across the floor. The officer pinned her down, shouting for backup. Richard reached his son, trembling, pulling him into a shaking embrace. "What's happening?" he whispered, voice breaking. Ethan could barely speak. "She tried to kill you, Dad. I think she already did this before. 2 other men." Vanessa struggled against the officer, her hair wild, her voice snapping like a whip. "You don't know anything," she screamed. "He was supposed to die months ago. He was weak. It was easy." The words slipped out before she realized what she'd said. The church gasped as the second officer arrived, handcuffing her. Ethan's knees gave out. The scene blurred in color and sound. His father's pale face, the flashing blue lights outside, Vanessa's shrill voice fading as she was dragged toward the police car. The last thing she said as she passed him made the blood drain from his face. "You think you saved him, but it's already too late." Ethan looked at his father, panic rising again. Richard clutched his chest, breathing ragged, and before Ethan could move, his father's legs buckled. The crowd screamed. The sirens wailed closer. The world tilted. And as Richard fell, the same silver vial rolled from Vanessa's bouquet across the floor, coming to rest by Ethan's shoe. The paramedics' boots pounded against the marble floor as if echoing Ethan's heartbeat. The church, moments ago a place of vows and hymns, now sounded like a battlefield. Voices overlapping, someone crying, the priest praying softly under his breath. Ethan knelt beside his father, his trembling hands pressed against Richard's chest, feeling the faint, erratic flutter beneath his palms. "Dad, stay with me, please," he whispered, voice cracking with terror. Richard's lips moved, forming silent words that never came. A paramedic pushed Ethan back gently, taking over with swift, practiced motions. The oxygen mask went on, the defibrillator pads followed, and every mechanical beep sounded like the ticking of a clock counting down the seconds left in Ethan's world. Vanessa, handcuffed now, was screaming from the back of the church. "He's faking." "He's fine." Her voice cut through the chaos, shrill, desperate, full of venom. The officers forced her outside, but Ethan could still hear her muffled laughter through the heavy wooden doors, and that sound burrowed into his mind like a curse. The silver vial still lay on the floor beside the bouquet, reflecting the flashing red and blue lights from outside. Ethan picked it up with shaking fingers, the cold glass slick with condensation. A faint bitter smell rose from it, chemical, metallic. The paramedic nearest to him glanced at the vial, eyes narrowing. "We'll need that," he said quickly, sealing it in an evidence bag. They lifted Richard onto a stretcher, rushing him through the crowd. Ethan followed, his hands bloodless and trembling. As they loaded his father into the ambulance, he caught one last glimpse of Vanessa through the window of the police car. Her face was pale now, stripped of its practiced calm, yet there was something behind her eyes, not fear but satisfaction. It was the look of someone who had set something in motion and was waiting to watch it unfold. The hospital corridor felt like an endless tunnel of white noise and fluorescent light. Hours passed without meaning. Ethan sat hunched in a plastic chair outside the ICU, his mind replaying every detail. Her fake names, the missing husbands, the cut on his father's wrist, the vial in her bouquet. The pieces formed a picture so grotesque it felt surreal. When the doctor finally emerged, his face was grave but calm. "Your father's alive," he said. But whatever was in his system nearly stopped his heart. "We found traces of digitalis. It's a cardiac toxin. Whoever administered it knew exactly what they were doing." Ethan felt the world tilt, the air vanish from his lungs. He wanted to scream, to run, but the only sound that escaped him was a quiet, broken laugh. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder, saying they'd call the police toxicology unit for evidence, then walked away. Ethan sat still, staring at his hands, at the faint tremor that wouldn't stop. She tried to kill him twice, he thought. Once with poison, once with love. As night deepened, a detective arrived, a weathered man named Harris with a tired voice and eyes that saw everything. He asked Ethan to recount everything he knew. Ethan told him about the aliases, the missing men, the photo of the tattoo, the storage unit, the email from unknown source. Harris listened, silent, taking notes, his jaw tightening with every new revelation. When Ethan finished, the detective sighed. "You did the right thing, son," he said quietly. "She's been on our radar for years. We just never had anyone alive who could point to her and say that's her. Until now. Will she stay locked up?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking between rage and exhaustion. Harris hesitated. "She's facing charges in 3 states, possibly homicide. But she's clever, manipulative. People like her don't go down easily." That word, easily, felt like a blade. The next day brought no peace. The hospital became both refuge and prison. Richard drifted in and out of consciousness, his voice faint, eyes clouded with confusion. "She said it was medicine," he murmured once. "Something to help my heart." Ethan swallowed hard, unable to respond. The truth was a knife he couldn't put back in its sheath. Late that night, as Ethan sat by his father's bedside, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The words were simple but froze him where he sat. "You shouldn't have opened the envelope." There was no signature, but the chill that ran through him told him exactly who had sent it. He rushed to the window overlooking the parking lot. Through the rain-smeared glass, a figure stood near the edge of the lights, a woman's silhouette, motionless, watching. He blinked and she was gone. The police confirmed the next morning that Vanessa, or Melissa, or whatever her name was, had escaped custody en route to a holding facility. The transport van had been found abandoned outside the city, one officer unconscious, the other missing. Detective Harris's voice over the phone was clipped. "We're tracking her. Stay inside. Don't go anywhere alone." But Ethan knew what that meant. She was out there, and she wasn't finished. That evening, the hospital hallways hummed with the quiet murmur of machines and nurses. Ethan stepped out to get coffee, exhaustion dragging him forward. When he returned, he noticed something on his father's bedside table, a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a photo. Him and his father from years ago, fishing by the lake, his mother smiling beside them. On the back, scrawled in Vanessa's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Every story has an ending, Ethan. You just don't know yours yet." The cup fell from his hand, coffee splattering across the tile. His chest tightened, breath short. He looked around, every shadow in the room suddenly alive. The heart monitor beside his father beeped steadily, then for a second stuttered. He froze. His gaze darted to the IV line, to the small injection port halfway up the tube. A tiny droplet of amber liquid clung to the plastic. Ethan's scream tore through the quiet. Nurses rushed in. Alarms erupted and chaos swallowed the room once more. Outside the window, somewhere in the darkness, a car engine started and vanished into the night. The police sirens faded into the distance as dawn broke over the hospital parking lot, streaking the rain-smeared windows with gold. Ethan sat in the same chair he had occupied for 3 endless nights, his hands trembling over the edge of a styrofoam cup gone cold hours ago. The events of the night had blurred into fragments. Nurses shouting, the sharp smell of antiseptic, his father's heart monitor screaming, then silence. Now only the steady, rhythmic beeping filled the air, fragile and precious, the sound of survival. Richard Collins was alive, barely, but alive. The poison hadn't reached a fatal dose this time. A nurse had caught the change in the monitor within seconds of Ethan's scream. It had been enough to save him. Detective Harris arrived at sunrise, the exhaustion carved deep into his face. He laid a folder on the bedside table, thick with reports and photos. "You deserve to know everything," he said quietly. "She's been using different names for more than 15 years. Melissa Crane, Vanessa Price, Claire Holt, all her. She targets widowers, lonely men with savings or property, convinces them she's their second chance. When they sign over assets, she poisons them slowly. Always makes it look natural. A heart attack, a fall, a stroke. The body count's uncertain, but we know at least 4 confirmed deaths. Your father would have been the 5th. Ethan stared at the photos. Faces of men smiling beside the same woman, her hair different in each. but the same eyes, always calm, always calculating. His throat burned. She watched him suffer, he whispered. Pretended to love him while killing him. Harris nodded grimly, and she almost got away again. But we got something this time. Her fingerprints at the IV port and the vial from the church. That's enough to bury her for life. Ethan's relief was short-lived. But she escaped, he reminded him, voice trembling. Harris hesitated, then opened the folder to another photo. A wrecked car at the bottom of a ravine, flames still curling from its twisted frame. She didn't get far, he said. Her car was found at 2 a.m., 20 miles north. The crash was violent. The body burned beyond recognition. But the necklace we found, the silver locket she never took off, confirmed it was her. Ethan couldn't tell if the tears that filled his eyes were from grief or release. He had wanted justice, but death felt too quiet, too easy for what she had done. Still, as he looked at the necklace in the photo, he felt the first hint of peace touch the edges of his exhaustion. The monster was gone. His father was safe. The story was over, or so he thought. 2 days later, Richard woke fully. His voice was weak, rasping, but the clarity in his eyes broke Ethan's heart. I remember, he said. She gave me pills every morning, said they were vitamins. He paused, tears gathering. I should have listened to you, son. Ethan took his father's hand, his own shaking. You wanted to believe in something good again, he said softly. That's not a crime, Dad, it's human. Richard's lips quivered into a faint smile. Your mother used to say the same thing, that love makes us blind but not evil. You saved me, Ethan, you saved both of us. Weeks passed. The hospital room became quieter, the machines fewer, until finally Richard was strong enough to return home. The house that once smelled of lilies now smelled of dust and lemon cleaner. Ethan helped his father pack away the remnants of that nightmare. The wedding decorations, the unopened gifts, the white ribbon still tied around the porch rail. Richard found the old family photo album, the one Vanessa had rearranged. Together they put every picture back where it belonged, restoring what she had tried to rewrite. One afternoon, as autumn leaves began to fall, Richard and Ethan visited his mother's grave. The sky was the color of pewter, soft and endless. Richard knelt, laying a single wildflower on the stone. I almost lost everything, he said quietly. Grief makes fools of us, doesn't it? Ethan crouched beside him, his voice gentle. Grief doesn't make fools, Dad, it makes believers. You just believed the wrong person. Richard nodded, his eyes glistening. You believed the truth even when it hurt. I didn't. That's the difference. He squeezed Ethan's shoulder, and for the first time in years, the silence between them was warm instead of wounded. As they stood to leave, Ethan looked out over the cemetery, feeling the strange stillness that comes only after surviving chaos. He realized something he hadn't before. The story hadn't been about stopping a wedding or exposing a killer. It had been about learning that truth isn't gentle. It saves, but it scars. His father's trust had nearly cost him his life, but Ethan's refusal to look away had saved it. Back at home, Richard poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to his son. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt like peace, not emptiness. On the table lay the police folder, closed, sealed, final. Richard placed his hand on it. I used to think second chances came in the shape of other people, he said. But maybe they come from within, from facing what we've lost and still choosing to live. Ethan smiled faintly. Maybe surviving is the real second chance. That night, as rain whispered against the windows, Ethan walked past his father's room and saw him asleep, breathing steady, safe. For the first time in months, there was no fear, no doubt, only quiet gratitude that the nightmare had ended. He went to his own room, opened the window, and let the cool night air wash over him. Down in the dark yard, the motion sensor light flicked on for a moment, triggered by wind or nothing at all. But Ethan didn't flinch. He watched it fade, and in the silence that followed, he whispered to himself, "She can't hurt us anymore." And for the first time, he believed it. Moral: sometimes the people we welcome into our lives wearing kindness are the ones who teach us how dangerous hope can be. But they also teach us that truth, once faced, becomes the strongest form of love.